Good evening. We're here with Public Poetry's ex Libris to celebrate Jack Myers. Jack Myers, a wonderful poet, nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, Texas Poet Laureate. Uh, the number of people Jack Myers has taught and touched and helped in the poetry world and just in general in his life are almost incalculable. But I think the number of people who showed up today and responded speak to that. And here to speak to it is our guest of the evening, NAOMI Shihabnai. Uh, NAOMI, tell us why you wanted to talk about Jack Myers.
Hi, Dom. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to have a chance to talk about Jack Myers. And Thea, it's really touching to me that you are on board here with us. Are you in Alaska right now?
I am. I'm in Fairbanks, Alaska, right this minute.
Wow. Well, as I have mentioned to you, I believe, this last book of Jack's, The Memory of Water, which was edited and has a gorgeous foreword by Mark Cox, is definitely one of my favorite books, not only by Jack, but by anyone I've read in years. And I had the occasion to use it in a class in Austin with Michener Writing Fellows last year or 2 years ago, I'm forgetting. But none of the students in the class, all very talented writers, had ever read Jack's poems before. And the comments that they made at the end of our sessions talking about this book, and at the end of the whole semester, in fact, were that they had never before read any book of poetry which made them want to live better lives, be better people, write better poems themselves. And I just thought that was an extraordinary comment. And it was unanimous in the class, and they were not all poets. Some of them were primarily playwrights, some were fiction writers, but there was a sense of Jack so present for them through this book alone that they felt their lives were changed. And because of that, I really found myself going back to this book, and I had read all of Jack's books I could get my hands on for maybe 30 years or 25, 29 years. It really made me appreciate the strength of his originality, his ability to create a world and a spirit in poetry which is so compelling that people would feel their lives changing after reading him. And something so authentic. That was a word that kept coming up. Everybody said, you just know this guy would have told you the truth. You know he wouldn't have tried to inflate himself in front of an audience and diminish other people by becoming larger. You know that he had a matter-of-fact truth about himself, because that is so present in his poems. And I just felt, as they talked about these poems, that he was invoked, embodied at our table. And for someone who really loved him as a human being and cared about his voice for so long, this was tremendously gratifying that the power of poetry can do that. One book can do that. So I urge any of you who have a chance to teach this book to others. Whether or not they ever met Jack or heard him read makes no difference, because none of these students had. Consider this voice as one that could really be present in someone's life ever after from reading the book. I find that we all love different poets for different reasons, but I think Jack's call to honesty in this particular book and the revelation of mortality and how the light and the dark mix, how the interior and exterior worlds are woven together in every poem, the humility, the absolute humility in the face of mysteries of death and life. I find it all so compelling and comforting. And there's nothing extra in this book, I feel, when I read it. There's no padding. There's no unnecessary embellishment. The poems are spare, and they have that minimalist quality that I always loved in Jack's work. And knowing his voice, you can hear his voice inside the poems. And of course, I think the voice adds to them, but I also think you can probably go online and find his voice and then add that voice to the poems if you never heard it in the flesh. But I think the way the book was arranged as well is extremely compelling. And I really appreciate Mark Cox for his diligence in putting together poems he loved and cared about by his beloved friend and mentor, and putting them together in a way that feels right and works for people.
Well, that's a wonderful introduction to the volume. Do you want to start now and read one of the poems, and then we'll go from there?
Sure. I'll read Dark Matter first, if that's okay.
Okay, let me see if I can find it on our screen thing.
Probably everybody who's tuned in here is a frequent traveler, and I know, Thea, you've been dealing with stuff, and this poem really touches me in terms of its commitment to traveling lightly, or not.
Okay.
Dark Matter. I've lived my life as if I were my wife packing for a trip. I'll need this and that, and I can't possibly do without that. But now I'm about what can be done without. I just need a thin valise. There's no place on earth where I can't unpack in a flash, down to a final spark of consciousness. No place where I can't enter the joyless rapture of almost remembering. I'll need this, and I'll need that, hoping to weigh less than silence, lighter than light. That second stanza is so amazing. But now I'm about what can be done without. I just need a thin valise. I mean, what poet doesn't feel that every time you work on a poem? Like, how can I dump all these extra words here? Where do I put them?
And of course, the word valise is a wonderful word to have within that particular section. Of
What?
Of what it's going to carry, because it also carries a sense of an old world of a classical realm, and I think in some ways Jack Myers is often under appreciated as being a poet on a grander scale. You know, when you look, you know, as I did, and I went back through my various volumes, you know, he does all the things you would expect a poet like Ovid to do. You know, he talks from the beginning. He talks about the brevity of life. He talks about sex. He talks about love. He talks about losing love. He talks about professional relationships. He uses dreams the way all of these mythologies to talk about how people change, what's going on. I mean, he was a poet of great breadth, and I think one of the things his language does is sometimes lets people underestimate the depth of his thinking, I think.
You know, I think he is a transparent poet in the way I've been talking about it. Dom and I have talked about it a little bit. His poems are effortless and they're clear, but every gesture moves the poem forward in such an amazing way. And then when his endings are just, they leave you in a totally new place, and they leave you wondering. And I think he's gotten so much out of the way of his own poems, and the trajectory of these poems, and the humor, and the humility, all these things come together, but the language isn't trying to be brocaded, it isn't trying to perform, it's simply aiding this amazing movement. And the other thing that I noticed reading this volume, I've been listening to Jack read poems since 1981 because we were colleagues at Vermont College and we knew each other a long time. And throughout that time, and again in this book, because I lost my other copy and had to get another one, so I didn't get to finish reading it, he's wonderful at showing all the different people who live in him and helping us see that we have the same thing ourselves. And he's made such good use of that without ever repeating himself. And I adore this book.
That is such a great and perfect comment, and I love that you use the word gesture, because I'm fascinated in all his poems how there's a tone, a matter-of-fact tone, very clear, very blunt, as you say, but there's also this transcendence that is always stitched throughout the poems, this kind of sense of penetrating vision. And maybe because of the matter-of-factness, it makes it easier to take that sense of transcendence and relate to it and claim it and feel close to it. But I was always charmed and amazed at how he weaves these things together, the frank, matter-of-fact, concrete, elemental place of being, as well as what you're seeing through. You know, here he calls it almost remembering, the joyless rapture of almost remembering.
One, if I could say something, I used to, when I first was dating Jack, he used to tell me, I work really, really hard at my poems. I work very, very hard at my poetry. And I saw what that meant, and I'm sure you did, Leslie, too, and you know, probably you too, Naomi, that you're talking about him getting out of his way. He used a reverse method than a lot of us beginners would use in writing, in the sense that his poem might first come out a little bit embellished and a little bit of ego, and he was constantly trying to strip that down. And, you know, whereas if I'm writing a poem, I go to the thesaurus and I try to not use the same word over and over again. He would actually go in, if you look at the poem, how many times he uses the word this and that and that and this. He probably originally wrote the poem with some kind of grander gesture and realized that's not what I'm trying to get to. I'm trying to get closer to the bone of that feeling. And so he would go in and he would actually use, he would put that or this word in 2 or 3 times on purpose, whereas I would take it out, he would put it in because it made it much more conversational. And that's how people do. They can't glean all those words when they're talking, and so he would deliberately do that.
Well, that's fascinating.
I hear that voice in my head still. I hear his voice all the time in my head. And it's friendly, and I'm so glad it's there.
I agree with you, Leslie. So do I. And I also hear something in that voice that's paring down, cutting back. So that's beautiful, Thea, to hear you describe it in that way. Fearless about sort of stripping away the excess. And, you know, when you read his poems, do you all do this? Like you read the poem back up from the bottom. After you read it down, you read it back up. and just see the way it was constructed and how neat it is and how each line has its own perfect weight. And I feel in Jack's poems, there's a kind of a very organic, rhythmic movement from one line into the next. When you read them back up, you feel it even more. Like the second and third time you read the poem, you feel it and hear it more. And so I can imagine him paring down until that rhythm became present for him.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I was alluding to earlier. Is his voice makes it seem like he was very casual. He worked very hard to have that sort of working class vernacular, what would be called the Vulgate, not vulgar, but it was the language people spoke, not necessarily an academic language. And it's easier to hear that and not recognize as you go through his poems and you look over and over again how skillfully constructed they are, how consciously constructed they are, how he puts in rhyme, he does all the things we expect a poet to do, and he makes it sound like it's somebody you've met while you stopped to have a beer, or you were just talking with somebody on the bus going somewhere. It's a phenomenally
that's a perfect description. Yeah, it's so engaging and so welcoming. I mean, I almost felt Jack's voice is a welcoming voice.
Yeah.
It pulls us into the poem with a kind of radiant, magnetic, attractive pull, and you finish the poem and you think, this is me, which is of course what we often want to feel in a poem, that the poet has managed to write into some kind of collective space where we all live together and understand one another and have empathy. And I feel that in Jack's poems more than in so many others.
That it has a direct intimacy. That a lot of times you get that sort of poetic view where people refer to you're going down the street and this is going on and the poet's addressing you and about halfway through the poem you just say, no, you're not talking about me. This has nothing to do with it. These are very conversational. They maintain that level of intimacy throughout, and that voice has been there from the very beginning. The events have changed. What he's described is, like anyone in their life would have to have changed, but the voice has always been there. It's always been true and believable.
Believable.
As I found.
Yeah.
I've been studying haiku the last few years, and there's actually something much more challenging about getting simple and stripping out all that language than writing a regular poem. I'm always telling people that I find it easier to write a sonnet, complete with rhyme and rhythm and everything, than to write a 3-line haiku, because stripping all that out down to the basics is really difficult, and people don't always appreciate it because it looks simple, but it's not.
That's right, Scott. I think you're very right. I mean,
it's good to see you, Naomi.
What?
It's good to see you. I haven't seen you. You weren't at Round Top this year.
Yeah, no, good to see you. Yeah, I mean, I just turned over to a line, and I remember loving this line. So I've walked in someone else's shoes, but I'm not better for it. I mean, how could you not just be in love? Lines like that. And the poems, it's as if the poems, when you finish them, they're not saying, look at me, the poem. They're saying, look at your life. And I think that's what the students responded to so heartily.
I think one of the other things that makes the poem so accessible and trustworthy is that they don't initially seem to take themselves seriously.
Right.
It's not uncommon to find a humorous situation, a joke, kind of a play of words, but they don't come from the sense that you have that they're comedic or it's a humorous poem.
Right.
It's, you know, in a more classic sense, it starts off comedic, but only to mask the fact that what he's talking about is quite often very tragic, very difficult, very complicated, and he doesn't make it's not a joke.
Right.
I think we were talking about this.
Go somewhere. I mean, you look at someone like Frank O'Hara, who's got a very conversational tone, but so often I don't find his poems go anywhere. They don't lead anywhere. They're just there. And that's not the case with these poems.
You know, these poems took me to places we were talking about that earlier. It took me to places I really did not want to go, which I think speaks well of them and probably less of me, but they were, as anyone who knew Jack, these were for real. These were not fiction or fictionalized. He was describing mortality close up with the same skill and effect that he did for every other poem. He didn't flinch. He played out all the cards exactly the same, and that is just astonishing. That's just huge courage, because the way he looked at stuff was just relatively straight at it. You know, this is what we're looking at. We're not looking at angels weren't coming. There wasn't going to be any salvation, but he was pleased to be alive. He was pleased to be doing it, and that was just. You know, it's good if you can think about philosophically doing that, being able to turn that into a piece of art, into a poem that reads as well as these poems do, and that is just pure genius.
Dom, there's
Yeah.
an much earlier poem of Jack's that I should have dug it up and brought it here. Thea, maybe you'll remember the name. I think I put it in the Texas anthology I made, where he talks about climbing a tree as a child and looking at parents inside, and it's as if they are people he doesn't know, and he doesn't know the language they're speaking. Just that feeling of kind of looking at your life by stepping out of it, as children often do. You step out, you look through the window, you get a different perspective, you climb a tree, you look down. And he says that all the language has fallen away. And there was something so profound in that poem that seemed to me to be so incredibly huge in terms of how childhood is, the way we look at the world of adults, as if it's a strange world of language we're not sure we even want to enter or be part of. But the way he was able to describe it as an adult, from a tree looking in, you know the poem I'm talking about.
I think it's in As Long as You're Happy. I think it's in As Long as You're Happy.
Yeah. It's such...
I've got that.
Yeah.
Talks about dipping the oars in the silence,
Yes.
and sitting on the tree,
Right.
watching them communicating and sort of being in awe that they're people talking to each other in the quiet of the dark of their bedroom together.
Right, and that feeling of a child's detachment from the world that they're in. And I think he had the gift of maintaining that, even in the face of his own mortality and his weakening days, that he was able somehow to stand back. I mean, I associate that poem with a later time in his life when that kind of detachment might have been very productive or helpful for him as a poet. And I just respect it so much that he was able to continue speaking, as Dom says, about places we might not want to even have to think about, or we might rather push to the side, but he was able to look through the window, even if he couldn't hear the whole conversation.
I think I'm there. Leaving the light on.
Yes, leaving the light on. Could we hear that poem?
I'll do my best. I'm not.
Okay.
I'll do it. Here we go. Returning home late one night, I realized I had no idea who mother and father were. So I climbed the spindly apple tree, wondering why darkness made me larger, and peered inside the room, listening first to one, then the other, like oars dipping in the darkness, towing the lighted window away. They were explaining while they spoke the simple names of things through which the world fell through confused. Mother, father, home, offering directions to others, to other like polite strangers. The ones who go on when it's all done, half finished, just begun, and they go on.
Wow. That's just an astonishing poem to me. I love that poem. It's full of the apprehension of the mystery of this existence. And it's giving us a scene. It's not overplaying it. It's just a magical, magical work.
And it goes through with themes that he talks about forever. He's always going. He's always coming home. He's always going home. He's always trying to understand the domestic confusion, the relationships of what's happening, and also has a sense that he's never going to do it. But he continues on with that going on optimism. I think there are like 3 or 4 other poems. I think there may be one in this volume. Go on. Just no matter what happens. Find a tree to piss against and go on. Just keep going with it. He's very encouraging from a philosophical standpoint.
Right.
You know, I knew Jack for a long time before I knew he was interested in Zen Buddhism. And he didn't deal with it the way people do who really cling to it as a spiritual practice. But I think it had a lot to do with this detachment you're talking about. His ability to see his flawed self and to replay it to us with such clarity and with something redemptive, but not redemptive because he was making it prettier, but just because of his awareness of it. And that awareness itself may have been his religion and may have been his manifestation of his faith.
I'd like to jump in on that one. Because to me, a couple of times you've talked about the...
Go ahead, turn on.
I'll see if I can get in. Okay. Naomi and Dom both talked about his revelation of mortality. To me, though, there is something essential in some of his poems that also attempt an approach at revealing immortality. And the one that I love is Life on Earth, which is on page 35 of his book, 36. Because he just has this marvelous vision in the last stanza of himself. You know, he says he's going to miss the sunlit numbness of being in the moment, though I'm enjoying the reverse, it all happening simultaneously, and me holding all of it inside me, totally dispersed. And if that's not a vision of, eternity, I don't know what is. It's just a beautiful, beautiful vision.
I love that poem. I have penciled stars all over that page.
Yeah.
Read the whole poem?
Yeah, I can read it.
Excellent.
It's called Life on Earth. During my life on Earth, I loved being showered by the sun's colored protons while seagulls screamed and days dredged back and forth in the sexual smell of fish. I loved my yellow consciousness that was a long yes hovering above me in blissful numbness like a gold ring promised to a blue afterlife. Yes, it was the sunlight numbness of being in the moment that I miss, though I'm enjoying the reverse, it all happening simultaneously, and me holding all of it inside me, totally dispersed. And the zenness of that, you know, I mean, I can't even quite grasp it, but I love it.
Gorgeous. That is a gorgeous poem.
Naomi, I don't know which poems you have marked to read, but do you have plans in there?
Plans?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I marked it. Let me see which page it's on.
Page 99?
Oh yes. Would you like to read it,
Oh,
Thea?
not 100, not 100, excuse me.
Yeah, got it.
Sure, go ahead.
I have it all marked up too. It's all marked up. Would you read it?
If you all really want me to. I've been doing a lot of talking the last few hours, as Dom will say. Dom, do you want to read it?
I'll read it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll have it. It's fine. Go ahead.
That's
Please,
all.
my guest.
Yeah.
I'm so fortunate to have two guests read. Please.
Okay, am I reading it? Plans. I thought of my soul as something like a scent, like an air of kindliness, that my selfish heart would grow enormous in battle. I thought I could help the troubled because I was troubled. I wanted my humility to be large, to float like a balloon above the parade I was in. But you know how it goes. My epic turned out to be a miniature self-portrait painted on a brick from a wall in me that had fallen in. My oxen were small as bugs. My arrows that I imagined treading the sky like black rain in a Japanese ink print melted back into brush strokes. So it's good to feel small once more, to bow at the end of a long line of becoming everything again. No more struggling to fit in after wind light sweeps me up or a dying ember takes me in as easily as I thought my life should have been. Or maybe what's next will be harder or nothing, or I'll be totally surprised without there being a me. I always felt like that anyway. But the place in me where all of this is missing has turned sacred over time. That's the best explanation I have for why we aren't allowed to know even the simplest things.
Yeah.
That's an astonishing poem.
You know, as you were reading it, Naomi, I kept thinking, that sounds like it could easily be a Naomi Nye poem.
Well, I love it so much, I'd take it. I mean, this poem, I feel like I want to live in this poem. And that line, so it's good to feel small once more. To bow at the end of a long line of becoming everything again. There we have that spirit of the last poem, the consciousness, the dispersal, and yet the containing of everything. And then how it ends with to know even the simplest things. I mean, this is a poem which takes on the mystery, the whole process of living. It's extraordinary how big these poems are.
And I love it because the entire time, even though you could see it as a Naomi poem, I just kept hearing Jack's irony and his humility and his laughing at himself the entire time. Because, you know, and I'm just going to give a little anecdote here just because I can't help it. It's just so beautiful. Do you remember that poem, Morisco's, that he was with Alison Hedge Coke and he dedicated it in here? And it's such a perfect narrative example of that sort of humility thing that Jack was always wrestling with, because part of him was trying to blow up big like a balloon, and then he'd pop and go, and then he'd build it back up again and go, and we used to laugh about that. And we were in that poem, he's sitting there, she's talking about this tireless thing down in South America where she's going to go read to the natives in war zones, and would he come join her? And he's looking at his soup like, should I ask? Is there any honorarium? his whole, and I could just see that person in all of these little, wanting to have his humility to be large. That irony is just so Jack.
Yes.
It's just, it's just so cute. And brilliant and in depth while it's being cute. Leslie, how he could be profound and cute at exactly the same time.
He allowed a lot of Jacks to live in him. And he did it socially, and he did it in his poems. And he could live on those two levels at once. And some of my favorites of his poems are when people inside him are arguing with each other.
Well, that's good too, Leslie, because the arguing suggests kind of the sides, voices, back and forth. Better than most of us, he was able to hold that back and forth, the kind of push-pull, the everywhere, the nowhere, the hugeness, the smallness. I made a phone call today to Joe Coomer. Anybody there know Joe Coomer?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful Texas novelist, and he's written books of nonfiction, and right now he has his first amazing book of poetry, looking for a publisher.
Wow.
But I knew that he had worked closely when he was an SMU student with Jack, because he organized the literary festival, and Jack was his sponsor for the literary festival. So I called him. He was driving to Maine, and his wife was transmitting the messages to the driver. And I said, Joe, if you could give me 2 words for Jack Myers, for him as a person, because you worked with him, what would they be? And he thought for a minute, and he said, well, for sure gracious, but also abrasively gracious, because that let me know that the graciousness was genuine. Like if he didn't like something I was trying to do as a student, he'd say, no, absolutely not, that's horrible, that'll never work. Cut it out. And then he'd be gracious when Joe had a good idea. And he said, well, I don't know if you should say that. Maybe people wouldn't like to hear that. But I thought he does that in his poems too. He has that honest, little abrasive rub, that frictional edge, which causes his revelations to be all the more compelling.
Because the friction's in him, between him and him and him and him.
Yeah.
That's so much energy to his poems.
Right. And the abrasive quality is humorous so often. It gives like the little rub of, well, I just said that, but now I'm doubting it. I mean, you get that real sense of he is in a relationship with everything that he is thinking in these poems.
I always had the sense with Jack that he would have liked to have been something other than a poet. That it wasn't the academic. I mean, he was wonderful at it, and that was his calling, and he understood it. But I think there was also part of him that never felt comfortable with that. Never felt comfortable with being an academic, with being in that sort of world, in a world that where his language and his grounding is so physical and based in the ordinary. To be in that much of a philosophical academic place, I think made him uncomfortable in a certain sense. He was, I think if he could have been a shortstop, he might have been eminently happier.
Well, probably, Leslie, you probably heard him talk about painting houses in his youth. And
Yeah.
I remember hearing him talk about that the first time probably I ever heard him give a reading. And so in my mind, I always kind of thought of him as this person on a ladder with a brush, with a bucket, you know, doing something very physical, but also being able to write these exquisite poems. So I think in my mind, I did always think of him as, you know, someone away from the desk, doing other things as well.
But he was also someone who was doing things away from the desk that his father would have understood. And at the same time, he's doing all these things his father would never understand. And living those two lives at the same time.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference too between him wanting to be a poet and him being a professor. I think if he could have been paid for his poetry and just doing his poetry, period, I think he wanted to do that since he was like 12. And he used to marvel at it. He told his father that he was going to be a poet, and his father said to him, "A poet? Well, those are a dime a dozen." And he used to say to me, "What was my dad thinking? What do you mean they're a dime a dozen?" Well, you know, so he never could understand his dad's discrediting of that. But I think the fact that he had to then go into the academy at I think he loved being there because he said it saved his life because he couldn't go back to painting houses. But if he could have been at a university, I think, where there was more appreciation of creative writing, like there was like a big department where creative writing was really revered, I think it would have been a different, he wouldn't have been so embarrassed. I think, there was just so much marginalizing of poets. He was the poet for a long time, and writers at SMU that I'm not sure that, I don't think he felt comfortable in the academy per se. I think,
well, Vermont College, didn't Vermont College make a huge difference to him?
It did, but he was struggling so much with 2 jobs and families that I think if he could have just done Vermont College and been paid enough, that would have been fine for him. I don't think there would have been a disconnect. But I think the problem, because that really did express a lot of who he was. Vermont College
really appreciated him in a huge, resonant, long-lasting way.
Yeah, I think he felt that way too. So I think it's really separate between being a poet and being a poet in the academy.
Yeah.
I think that's also one of the reasons why we appreciate him, probably even more, is that's something that comes across, that sort of internal struggle of saying I'm in a place I don't feel comfortable in. Nonetheless, I'm going to go to work and do my job as a poet. That's what I'm here to do. These are these other things I kind of had to endure, but will never quite seem as apt at as others are. I think that gave him an additional lens in being able to see clearly that, I don't think he ever took the job of being a teacher. He took it seriously, but I don't think he took it as pretentiously as some I have met. I'll just say. Do we have time to do another poem?
Could we read the series?
Yeah, give me a second and I'll try and get it on the screen.
Okay.
That's easier.
You want someone else to read it?
Can I ask an editorial question? Was anyone else bothered by the choice of putting it all in italics, because it was not in the manuscript all italicized?
I really like it in italics.
Do you? Okay.
It makes me look that.
It makes you what?
It has a lightness, like what it's talking about.
Okay, good.
Okay, can everybody see the poem?
Yes.
Is it
And
there?
it's
Can you read it?
Not in italics there.
Oh, okay, okay.
No. But Thea, it's true. When I carry this
No,
poem in
that's my computer. Okay.
in my mind, this
Someone
book
tell
is
me.
italicized. It feels that it should be.
Okay.
All right. Is everybody there? Is it starting to blip out?
No, people just
We're here.
got tired of looking at themselves. They're all here.
Curious. I'd like to leave an imprint on the world lighter than I'd formerly meant. Just a scent, not the thud of the thing steaming on a plate. Instead of, I told you so, let my epitaph be the glance, the edge, the mist, the delicately attenuated swirl of an innuendo instead of the thunderhead. The rain that fell when I was ambitious seemed conspiringly rushed in my way. But the same rain today tastes of here and now because of where it's been. I'd like to be gentle with small, great things. They are larger than what we think we came here for. I'd like to be an eye of light that opens the air and burns beyond ambition, like the sun that can't see us and is beyond our human reach, yet is in us trillions of times over.
Beautiful.
You can read that poem without a chill. Brilliant.
Yeah, it speaks, and I don't want to necessarily portray myself as the ageist person here, but I think I am. But it speaks not necessarily of just of wisdom, because there are lots of poems that really start out to be wise and start out to give you advice. This is stuff that somebody's paid for, and they're going to give it to you now, and it's not going to be forthcoming, but you can look at it. Yeah, this is, it's kind of what you always hoped your grandfather would tell you. Give you this kind of, it's not the big things. It's the little things that you need to pay attention to. Things are going to be over quickly. Life lasts a long time, but it goes really quick, and those kinds of things. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful tone he maintains throughout the book. That speaks well of that sort of existential Zen. That it's redemption without salvation. He's not looking for anything other than that, and not a golden moment of that. It's just a misty rain. It's a drizzle. I'm walking the dog. It's wonderful, wonderful.
He reminds me of a wonderful book I read of William Stafford, The Way It Is. It really reminds me of his, I'm so glad I'm hearing these poems today. Sorry to say I haven't heard his poems before, but William Stafford is one of my favorites, and it reminds me of him. The Zen element of his poems.
Well, that same simplicity of language.
Well, he also trusts in the flow of his own thought. However much editing he had to do, as Thea told us earlier, these poems the arc of association in his poems just excites me so much. It's like swimming in beautiful clear water.
Mm-hmm. And Leslie, I've been reminded on this program how much I love how you talk about poetry.
Oh, thank you.
I felt that for around 30 years as well.
We need to do that again while we're shopping for shoes and socks.
Yeah, I think we should. But I love what you just said, because there is such a trust in his own willingness to flow within the images, within the phrases, the lines of the poem.
And that's what William Stafford talks about.
Absolutely.
as I've gotten older, I've tried to just trust that more, because I think when we're younger and trying to impress everybody, we get in our own way. And I think Jack is a wonderful example of just trying to tell the truth. And I'll bet when he did all that revising, I love that Thea told us about what he had to do, because I think he was getting out of his own way. And I think that as he made those poems what he wanted them to be, he realized he was telling the truth. I'll bet he knew he was telling the truth.
Yep. Yeah.
It was almost like he was clawing his way through all the bullshit. Like, oh, this is a bullshit line, and this is a bullshit work, and this isn't truthful, and this isn't honest. And he was just just kept, throwing this out, throwing that out, and then he'd go over and pick this sock back up and realize it did match the other sock, and it was just that kind of, way that he did it.
And that's where a kind of abrasive slash attitude with a page would be much more helpful than a sort of precious, oh, I wrote this down, I can't possibly throw it away attitude. And I think you feel that authenticity in the movement, the velocity, the energy of these poems, that they're coming from a very essential place because he's allowed himself to do that. He's allowed himself to throw away the excess.
I have to come back. Yeah, I think, the abrasive part was one of those things that I as a guy, I'll go for it. I've been old now. I'll just speak for all males. Thanks, Chris. If you want to wave your hand, you can join in. Jack was kind of like a guy, more than he was like a poet. When I met him, any place, we would go and play pool. We didn't, he did not want to play pool with Jack for any money at all. He was really good at it. But he had that sort of sense of maleness. I mean, lots of, when I first met him in the late 70s or early 80s, it was like feminist heaven, and Jack was kind of alone on the range out there as just being kind of a guy's guy. Not that he was really overly macho or obnoxious, but I mean, he certainly spoke in male idiom and didn't have that sense that he was afraid to tell people things. If you needed to be told something, he would tell you. I picked him up at an airport once, and we were driving. I was walking through, dragging his luggage, and we picked up the luggage, and the attendant had BO, and he said, "Man, you need to take a bath." That's kind of really, the guy needed to know, and that was really kind of that whole sense of, you need to know this. He doesn't tell you things you can live without. It's not an entertainment. I think I've gone too far. I'm not certain. But it was one of the many reasons that I was so pleased to be able to bring Jack back into the air. This is my the purpose of the sole purpose of this program is to bring people back into the air, and because his voice is not there anymore. There isn't someone that took his place, and I don't think anyone ever will.
His voice is indelible, and I want to make just a pitch for the book, because I think, Thea, didn't you tell me it is still available from Western Michigan University Press? And
it's New Issues. New Issues Press.
New Issues Press. Okay.
Right, but that's the university where New Issues is based.
Okay, New Issues is at Western
Yes.
Michigan University. But
How
anyone
to-
who has a chance to use this book in a class, even a weekend workshop, I can't urge it more because I've seen what it does to a group and how it brought our group so much together, and I would love to use it again in a class soon. But even if you had only a one-day session, I think it would be worth your time with your students so they could have this book and have a discussion about the memory of water. So I hope as people who care about Jack's voice will continue to spread the word about this particular book and everything he gave us.
May I say one other thing? Some of you are doing outreach programs with cancer survivors and families who've been impacted by cancer, or also people who are suicide survivors who had suicide in the family. One of the really strong things I feel about this book is that it captures a heart that has been pierced by these experiences.
Yes.
And I have found that one of the things that these people are going through is, yes, they're grieving, and yes, there's pain, but they're also kind of sickened by people giving them platitudes and memes that don't really get to their experience. And I have found that some of the very directness of these experiences in this poem has really spoken well to people going through with these problems. It's a fantastic record or x-ray of what's happening emotionally while going through these very human experiences.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dom.